It's easy to forget. But for most of human history, people had no way to write things down, and still messages travelled, somehow. Not through letters or symbols on a page, but through memory, through objects, through small signals that only made sense if you knew how to read them. This one is from that quieter side of history. Here on Made for Sleep, we take these kinds of ideas and slow them down, building them out from research our team spends time with, rather than rushing past. So let the rain settle in a bit, and if you're still here for a moment, you can share how you're doing and what time it is where you are. You're walking along a ridgeline in what will eventually be called the Andes, though the people who carved this path into the mountainside have their own name for these peaks. The air is thin enough that you notice you're breathing, and the light has that particular quality it gets at high altitude, sharp and clear, making distant features seem closer than they actually are. A runner passes you going the opposite direction, moving at a pace that seems impossible given the elevation. He's young, maybe 16, and he's carrying a small bundle of knotted cords looped through his belt. He doesn't slow down, but he acknowledges you with a brief nod before continuing his descent toward the valley below. Those cords aren't decorative. Each knot represents information. Tribute owed, census data, calendar dates, quantities of stored maize. The system is called quipu, and the runner has been trained since childhood to read the knots by touch and position. He's carrying an administrative message that would take several paragraphs to write out in Spanish, but he doesn't need Spanish or any written language. The knots tell him everything. 3 knots in a row mean one thing. A figure-8 knot means something else. The colour of the cord matters. The distance between clusters matters. It's a language, just not one that requires literacy in the conventional sense. You watch him disappear around a switchback, and you realise something that wouldn't have occurred to you back in the world of smartphones and instant messaging. This system works. It's been working for generations. The Inca Empire coordinates a territory stretching thousands of miles using these runners and their knotted cords. Tax records are kept. Construction projects are planned. Messages from the capital reach provincial administrators in days, not weeks. No paper, no ink, no alphabet. Just fibre, knots, and people trained to remember what each configuration means. The sky's beginning to take on that late afternoon quality where the light turns golden. You start descending toward the valley yourself, following the same worn path the runner used. As you walk, you pass a series of stone markers placed at regular intervals along the trail. They're not random. Each one marks a distance that a runner can comfortably cover before needing to rest. The Empire has thought this through. The system doesn't rely on superhuman endurance. It relies on relay points, on people stationed at intervals who can take the message and carry it forward while the previous runner rests. It's elegant in its practicality. By the time you reach the first way station, the light is failing. The small shelter is built into the hillside, just large enough for a runner to sleep in and store basic supplies. There's a depression in the ground where countless fires have been built, and you can see the valley spreading out below, already filling with shadow. Smoke rises from a distant village, a thin column that disperses as it climbs. The smoke isn't random either. It's coming from a signal fire, and if you knew the code, you could read it. 1 column means one thing. 2 columns mean something else. The timing between smoke bursts carries information. It's another language, visible across distances that would make shouting useless. You settle near the fire pit as the last light drains from the sky. The valley below becomes a collection of scattered lights. Cooking fires, signal fires, torches moving along paths. Each light is a point of human activity, and many of them are sending messages, whether intentionally or not. A fire that burns all night in a particular location tells people that the settlement is occupied. A fire that goes out tells them something has changed. A torch moving along a ridge line indicates travel, and the direction of travel might matter to someone watching. The temperature drops quickly at this altitude. You pull your woven cloak tighter and watch the stars emerge, the same stars people have been using for navigation and timekeeping for thousands of years. The Milky Way becomes visible, that dense river of light that indigenous peoples in this region call Mayu, the celestial river. The dark patches between stars form shapes, a llama, a fox, a toad, and these shapes tell stories that contain practical information about seasons, planting times, weather patterns. The night sky is a calendar and a storybook, accessible to anyone who has learned to read it. A sound carries up from the valley. It takes you a moment to identify it. Drums. Not the frantic beating of a war drum, but a steady rhythmic pattern that repeats with slight variations. The pattern is communicating something specific. In forests across equatorial Africa, similar drums are used to send detailed messages over distances of several miles. The drums don't just make noise, they mimic the tonal patterns of spoken language. In tonal languages, the same syllable can mean different things depending on pitch, and the drums reproduce those pitch patterns. A skilled drummer can send a complex message that a trained listener can understand as clearly as if the words were spoken aloud. The system is so effective that colonial administrators, arriving centuries later with their written dispatches and telegraphs, will be consistently amazed by how quickly information travels through regions they assumed were isolated and primitive. You close your eyes and listen to the drums. The pattern continues, steady and unhurried. There's no urgency in it, just information being transmitted across the dark valley. When the drumming stops, the silence feels different, fuller somehow, as if the message is still present in the air waiting to be received. The fire at the way station has burned down to coals. You add a few pieces of dried wood and watch the flames rise, casting moving shadows on the stone walls of the shelter. Fire has been humanity's first technology, and also one of its first communication tools. A fire on a hilltop is visible for miles. A series of fires can relay a message across entire regions in a matter of hours. The ancient Greeks used fire beacons to send news of Troy's fall across the Aegean. The Great Wall of China incorporated beacon towers at regular intervals, creating a visual communication network that could alert distant garrisons to border threats. The system was simple. One fire meant one thing, two fires meant something else, and the timing of the fires could add additional nuance. But fire signals have limitations. They work best at night when the flames are visible. During the day, smoke becomes more useful, but smoke requires constant tending to maintain the right density and colour. Weather interferes with both. A foggy night renders fire signals useless. High winds disperse smoke too quickly. Rain extinguishes flames. The system works well in good conditions, which means it works most of the time, but not all of the time. The people who relied on these signals understood these limitations and planned accordingly. Important messages went out multiple times through multiple channels. Redundancy was built into the system. You wake sometime before dawn, though you don't remember falling asleep. The valley's completely dark now. The fires below either banked for the night or extinguished. The silence is profound. At this altitude there are no insects, no night birds, just wind, and the occasional settling of stones as the temperature shifts. You stand and stretch, feeling the stiffness that comes from sleeping on stone, and you notice something you missed earlier, marks on the shelter wall. Not decoration, but information. Symbols that indicate direction, distance, terrain. A later traveller would call these petroglyphs, but that term makes them sound ancient and mysterious when they're actually quite practical. They're a map, a set of trail markers, a record of who passed through and when. The symbols aren't standardised in the way a modern map is standardised. Different groups use different marks, different conventions. But within a particular region, among people who travel these routes regularly, the symbols are perfectly legible. A zigzag line means water. A circle with radiating lines means a settlement. A series of vertical marks counts something. Days of travel, probably. The system works because the people who use it share the same understanding, the same training, the same context. Take someone from a different region, and they might not be able to read these marks at all. But that's true of any writing system. An alphabet is just a shared convention, an agreement that certain marks represent certain sounds. These petroglyphs are a different kind of shared convention, one that doesn't require literacy in the conventional sense. The sky's beginning to lighten, that deep blue that comes just before dawn. You start walking again, following the trail down toward the valley. As you descend, the air becomes easier to breathe. Plants reappear, first hardy grasses, then shrubs, then eventually trees. The trail is well maintained, which tells you something about how frequently it's used. Stones have been cleared, erosion has been managed. At several points the trail has been reinforced with retaining walls to prevent it from washing out during the rainy season. All of this is communication in a way. The trail itself is a message. This route is important. This route is maintained. This route is safe to use. You reach a small stream as the sun breaks over the ridge behind you. The water is clear and cold, running over smooth stones. You drink, and you notice that someone has stacked rocks in a particular pattern at the edge of the stream. The stack is deliberate, too balanced to be natural. It's a marker, probably indicating that this is safe drinking water, or that this is a recognised rest point, or both. You see these stacked rock markers more frequently as you continue down the trail. They're another form of non-written communication, another way of saying, people have been here, people will come again, this is part of the known world. The valley floor is warmer and greener. You pass terraced fields where maize is growing in neat rows. The terraces themselves are messages about water management, labour organisation, agricultural knowledge. They communicate that this community has surplus labour, that they can undertake large-scale projects, that they understand hydrology and soil retention. All of this is legible to someone who knows how to read landscapes. A group of people is working in one of the fields. They notice you approaching and one of them raises a hand in greeting. No words are exchanged. The gesture is enough. You continue past, following the trail toward what looks like a larger settlement in the distance. As you walk, you hear singing. Not a performance, but work songs. Rhythmic, repetitive, helping coordinate the movement of people doing physical labour. The songs carry information too. They establish pace. They mark time. They encode cultural knowledge that might be practical, like when to plant certain crops based on environmental signs or social, reinforcing community bonds through shared rhythm and melody. By midday, you've reached the settlement. It's larger than you expected. Several hundred people, maybe more. The buildings are adobe and stone, arranged around a central plaza where a market is taking place. People are trading goods without currency, textiles for ceramics, dried meat for fresh vegetables, coca leaves for maize beer. Each transaction involves negotiation, and the negotiation happens through a combination of gestures, vocal tones, and physical demonstration. A vendor holds up fingers to indicate quantity. A buyer nods or shakes their head. Someone lifts a textile to the light to show its quality. Another person sniffs a food item to check freshness. It's all communication, all information exchange, and none of it requires writing. You find a shaded spot at the edge of the plaza and watch. The market has a rhythm to it, a pattern that becomes clear as you observe. Certain vendors are positioned in certain spots, which seems to indicate status or specialization. The flow of foot traffic follows established paths. People greet each other with specific gestures that vary depending on relationship and status. A slight bow, a hand to the chest, a touch on the shoulder. Each gesture is a message about social position, about familiarity, about respect. The system is complex and nuanced, but everyone here navigates it fluently because they've been learning it since childhood. An older woman sits near the centre of the plaza, and people approach her periodically to speak. She's not selling anything. She's not buying anything. She's listening, and occasionally she responds at length. It takes you a while to understand what's happening. She's a keeper of oral tradition, someone who holds the community's collective memory. People come to her to settle disputes, to verify lineage, to confirm the details of important events. She remembers things that happened before most of the people in the plaza were born, and her memory is the archive, the record, the authority. In a literate culture, you would consult written documents. Here, you consult her. You listen as she speaks to a young man who seems to be asking about his family history. She recites names, relationships, events, all without hesitation. The information comes out in a rhythmic, almost musical pattern. Not quite singing, but not quite ordinary speech either. The rhythm helps her remember. It also helps the listener remember. The pattern creates a structure, and the structure makes the information more retainable. This is mnemonic technique at work, the same technique that oral poets have used for thousands of years to memorize epic narratives like the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh. The rhythm isn't decoration, it's technology. The sun is high now, and the plaza is hot. Most people have retreated to shaded areas or returned to their homes for the midday rest period. You find a spot under a tree and settle in, watching the settlement slow down. A few dogs wander through the empty plaza. A child plays with a ball made of wrapped cloth. The mountains in the distance are hazy with heat and dust. You think about the runner you saw this morning carrying his knotted cords. You think about the drums in the valley, the fire signals, the trail markers, The oral historian in the plaza. None of these people are illiterate in the sense of being unable to communicate complex information. They're using different literacies, different systems, different technologies. The quipu is a technology. The drum language is a technology. The mnemonic techniques are technology. They're just not technologies that require an alphabet. Writing, when it eventually develops in various cultures around the world, will be revolutionary. It will allow information to persist without human memory. It will enable communication across time as well as space. A written message can outlive its author by centuries. But writing also has costs. It requires materials, papyrus, parchment, paper, clay. It requires tools, styluses, brushes, chisels. It requires training that not everyone can access. For most of human history, literacy has been a specialised skill, limited to a small percentage of the population. The methods you've been observing today are more democratic in some ways. Anyone can learn to read smoke signals. Anyone can learn to interpret trail markers. Anyone can participate in oral tradition. The afternoon heat is making you drowsy. You close your eyes and listen to the sounds of the settlement, voices in the distance, the rhythmic sound of someone grinding maize, birds in the tree above you. The sounds form a kind of ambient information stream, telling you that everything is normal, everything is functioning, the community is going about its usual business. When you open your eyes again, the light has changed. It's later than you thought, probably mid-afternoon. The plaza is becoming active again as people emerge from their midday rest. You stand and stretch, then start walking toward the edge of the settlement, following a path that leads toward the river. The river is wide and brown, moving quickly with snowmelt from the mountains. A bridge crosses it, not a modern suspension bridge, but a simple structure made of woven grass rope and wooden planks. The bridge itself is a message. People cooperated to build this. People maintain it. People trust it enough to use it. Engineering is a form of communication. It says, we can do this, we have done this, we will continue to do this. You cross the bridge carefully, feeling it sway slightly under your weight. On the far side, the landscape becomes less cultivated. The trail continues, but it's narrower now, less travelled. You're leaving the zone of intensive settlement and entering what might be considered wilderness, though that term doesn't quite fit. People clearly use this area. You can see evidence of recent campfires, more trail markers, trees that have been deliberately shaped or pruned. It's not wilderness in the sense of being untouched. It's managed space, used space, known space. As you walk, you notice how the trail follows the landscape intelligently. It avoids steep grades where possible. It stays near water sources. It takes advantage of natural viewpoints where you can see potential hazards or opportunities. The trail is the accumulated knowledge of everyone who has ever walked this route, refined over generations into an optimal path. Following it is like reading a very old, very detailed set of directions that were never written down. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows through the trees. You hear water ahead, a waterfall probably. The sound gets louder as you approach, and then you round a bend and see it, a substantial waterfall dropping maybe 30 feet into a clear pool. The mist from the falling water creates rainbows in the afternoon light. It's the kind of place that would inevitably become sacred in any culture, the kind of place where the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary feels thin. There are offerings at the base of the waterfall, small bundles of woven grass, a few carved wooden objects, shells that must have been carried from the coast. Each offering is a message, a communication with whatever forces are believed to govern this place. The offerings are also messages to other people. This place is recognized, this place is respected, this place has significance. Without any written sign, without any spoken explanation, you understand immediately that this is a site that matters. You sit near the pool for a while, watching the water. The sound of the waterfall is constant but not monotonous. It shifts and changes with variations in the wind, with the movement of the water itself. After a while, the sound stops being something you actively hear and becomes more like a physical presence, a vibration you feel as much as hear. The light is fading. You should probably start looking for a place to camp, but you're reluctant to leave this spot. The air near the waterfall is cool and fresh, completely different from the dusty heat of the valley. Eventually, though, the practical need for shelter wins out. You stand and start looking for a suitable camping spot. You find one a short distance from the waterfall, a flat area protected by overhanging rocks. with evidence that other travellers have used it before. There's a fire ring and a small stack of dry wood that someone left for the next traveller. That's another form of communication. I was here, I used this place, I'm making it easier for whoever comes next. It's a small gesture, but it's part of a larger pattern of reciprocity and mutual aid that makes this kind of travel possible. You build a fire as the last light disappears. The flames push back the darkness, creating a small sphere of warmth and visibility. Beyond the firelight, the forest is completely black. You can hear it though, the sounds of insects, of small animals moving through undergrowth, of wind in the trees. Each sound carries information if you know how to interpret it. That particular rustling means a certain kind of animal. That silence means a predator might be nearby. That distant call means water is in that direction. You've brought dried meat and maize cakes which you eat slowly while watching the fire. The food itself carries information. It tells you about agricultural practices, preservation techniques, trade networks. The maize was grown in a valley somewhere. The meat was hunted or raised and then dried according to specific methods that prevent spoilage. Both items have travelled through multiple hands before reaching you, though no receipts or bills of sale were involved. The exchange happened through barter, through social networks, through systems of reciprocity that don't require written contracts. The fire burns down to coals. You add a few more pieces of wood and arrange them to burn slowly through the night. The temperature has dropped significantly, but the fire keeps you comfortable. You wrap yourself in your woven cloak and settle in to sleep. Sleep comes and goes. You drift in and out, aware of the fire, aware of the sounds of the forest, but not quite fully conscious. At some point in the deep night, you wake fully and lie there watching the stars. The constellation patterns are the same ones people have been watching for millennia, though different cultures see different shapes in them and tell different stories about them. The stories are ways of remembering the star positions, and the star positions are ways of navigating, of telling time, of predicting seasons. It's all connected, story and utility, myth and practical knowledge. The eastern sky begins to lighten, the stars fade, the forest around you becomes visible again, emerging from darkness like a photograph developing. Birds begin to sing, each species with its own pattern, its own contribution to the dawn chorus. The patterns are partly genetic, each species is born knowing its song, but they're also learned and modified. Young birds learn refinements from older birds. Regional variations develop. The bird songs are both nature and culture, both innate and taught. You rebuild the fire and boil water for a simple breakfast of maize porridge. The hot food is comforting in the morning chill. By the time you've finished eating and packed up your few belongings, the sun has risen above the trees and the forest is warming up. You continue along the trail. It climbs gradually, following a ridge that offers occasional views of the valley below. The settlement you visited yesterday is visible in the distance, a cluster of structures near the river. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Even from this distance, you can tell that the community is waking up, starting its daily routines. The trail becomes steeper. You're climbing again, heading toward a pass visible in the distance. The vegetation changes as you gain elevation. Fewer trees, more hardy shrubs and grasses. The air becomes thinner again. Your pace slows. Near midday, you reach the pass. It's marked by a large cairn, a mound of stones that travellers have added to over years, maybe generations. The cairn serves multiple purposes. It marks the highest point of the trail, it serves as a landmark visible from distance, and it acts as a kind of communal monument, a physical record of everyone who has passed this way. You add a stone to the pile, continuing the tradition. From the pass you can see into a new valley. The landscape on this side is different, drier, more open. The vegetation is sparse. In the distance you can see what might be a large lake, though the heat shimmer makes it hard to be certain. The descent is gradual. The trail switchbacks down the slope in a series of long traverses. As you descend, you notice more rock art, images carved or painted on stone outcroppings. Some are clearly old, the pigments faded, the carving weathered. Others look more recent. The images show animals, human figures, geometric patterns. Some might be decorative. Others clearly convey information, maps perhaps, or records of important events or boundary markers. One panel shows a series of footprints leading to a water source. It's not subtle or mysterious. It's a sign, as clear as a modern highway sign saying water this way. Another panel shows what looks like a large animal, maybe a llama or an alpaca, with lines radiating from it. The meaning isn't immediately obvious to you, but you can guess. This is grazing territory, or this is where such animals can be found, or this represents someone's claim to those animals. The afternoon is hot and dry. You're grateful when the trail reaches the valley floor and you can see actual water ahead. A stream running between banks lined with green vegetation. You stop to rest in the shade of a large rock, drinking from the stream and refilling your water container. The stream runs toward the lake you saw from the pass. Following it seems like a reasonable plan, so you do, walking along the bank through increasingly marshy terrain. Birds are everywhere. Waterfowl of various kinds, wading birds, small songbirds in the reeds. Their calls overlap and combine into a constant backdrop of sound. The lake, when you reach it, is larger than you expected. It stretches to the horizon, the far shore invisible in the haze. The water is very still, reflecting the sky like hammered metal. There's a settlement near the shore, a collection of reed houses built partially over the water on wooden platforms. As you approach, someone in a reed boat paddles toward shore. The boat is made entirely of bundled reeds, shaped into a sleek curve that rides high in the water. The paddler is a woman, maybe in her 30s, and she's bringing in a catch of fish. She beaches the boat and begins unloading the fish into woven baskets. She notices you watching and nods in greeting, but doesn't speak. You nod back. The settlement here is quieter than the mountain village. People move with the unhurried pace of a fishing community. Someone is repairing a net, the repetitive motions hypnotic to watch. Someone else is weaving new reeds into a house wall, replacing sections damaged by weather or time. Children are playing in the shallow water near shore, their laughter carrying across the lake. You find a spot near the water and sit, watching the settlement go about its business. A man approaches and offers you fish, freshly caught, still cold from the lake water. You accept with a grateful nod and realise you're participating in the same gift economy you've seen everywhere on this journey. He gives you fish. Later, you might give something to someone else. No accounting is kept, no debts are recorded, but the system balances out over time through social memory and reciprocal obligation. The sun is setting over the lake, turning the water orange and pink. The colours are intense, almost unreal. The reed houses become dark silhouettes against the bright water. Cooking fires are lit and smoke drifts across the settlement, carrying the smell of roasting fish and some kind of grain. You build a small fire near the shore and cook the fish you were given. It's good, simple, fresh, perfect. As you eat, you watch the light fade from the sky. The lake becomes dark. The stars appear, reflected in the still water so perfectly that it's hard to tell where the sky ends and the water begins. Someone nearby is playing a flute, a simple instrument made from a reed, but the music is complex and beautiful. The melody rises and falls, repeats with variations, creates a mood that matches the darkening evening. It's not performance music exactly. It's more like ambient sound, like the wind or the water, but shaped by human intention. The flute music continues for a long time, then gradually trails off into silence. The settlement becomes quiet. Fires burn down. People retreat into their reed houses. You wrap yourself in your cloak and lie down near your fire, looking up at the stars. Sleep comes easily here. The sound of the water is gentle and constant. The air is cool but not cold. You drift off, wondering about all the messages that have travelled across this landscape. The quipu runners, the drum signals, the smoke signs, the oral traditions, the trail markers, the rock art. All of it is communication. All of it is information. All of it happens without writing. You dream, or think you dream, of patterns in the stars, of knots in chords, of rhythms in drums. When you wake, the sky is just beginning to lighten. The lake is perfectly still, like glass. A few birds are calling, but otherwise the world is silent. You lie there for a while, not quite ready to move. The settlement is still asleep. The first light is touching the mountains in the distance, but the valley itself is still in shadow. It's that in-between time, neither night nor day, when the world feels suspended. Eventually you stand and walk to the water's edge. The lake is cold and clear. You can see fish moving in the shallows, navigating between the reed stalks with small economical movements. The water reflects the sky, which is beginning to show colour. Pale blue, then deeper blue, then touches of pink and orange as the sun approaches the horizon. You think about the journey you've been on, the different forms of communication you've encountered, the quipu with its knotted messages, the drums speaking across valleys, the smoke signals on hilltops, the trail markers and rock art, the oral historians carrying entire genealogies in memory, the bird songs and star patterns, the offerings at sacred sites, the shared meals and gift exchanges. All of it is language in a sense. All of it is humans sharing information, creating meaning, building culture. Writing, when it comes, will be powerful and transformative, but it won't replace these other systems entirely. People will continue to use oral tradition alongside written records. Trail markers will persist even after the invention of written maps. Gift economies will coexist with written contracts. The old methods will adapt, evolve, combine with the new. But in this moment, in this place, writing doesn't exist yet. The world functions without it. Messages travel. Knowledge is preserved. Communities coordinate and cooperate. The systems work. The sun breaks the horizon. The lake catches fire with reflected light. The settlement begins to stir. People emerging from reed houses, fires being rekindled, the day beginning. You stay at the lake settlement for another day, watching how the community functions. There's a rhythm to life here that's different from the mountain villages. Everything moves at the pace of the water, slow, steady, inevitable. People rise with the sun and fish in the cool morning hours. They return midday when the fish stop biting and spend the hot afternoon hours maintaining equipment, repairing houses, preparing food. As evening approaches, the boats go out again for the second fishing period. You notice how information travels through this community. There's no town crier, no central announcement system, but everyone seems to know what everyone else is doing. A boat returns with an unusually large catch, and within minutes people gather to help process the fish. Someone's roof needs repair, and neighbours appear with bundles of fresh reeds without being asked. It's as if the community operates as a single organism, with information flowing through it invisibly, through observation and long-established patterns of cooperation. An older man sits near the shore working on something you don't immediately recognise. As you watch, you realise he's making a quipu, not the administrative kind you saw the runner carrying, but something simpler, a personal record perhaps, or a teaching tool. He works slowly, his fingers moving with practiced precision, creating knots in a specific sequence. A young girl sits beside him, watching intently. He doesn't explain what he's doing. She just observes, and occasionally he hands her a cord and lets her try making a knot under his supervision. This is how the knowledge transfers, not through formal instruction, but through observation, imitation, and gradual participation. The lake itself is a form of communication infrastructure. The water allows travel and trade over distances that would be difficult to cover on foot. You watch boats coming and going throughout the day. Some are clearly fishing. Others are transporting goods, bundles of reeds, baskets of grain, pottery. A few seem to be carrying passengers. Each boat is broadcasting information just by its presence and direction. This route is navigable. This settlement is accessible. This community is connected to other communities. In the evening you sit with a group near one of the fires. No one speaks much, but the silence is comfortable, communal. Someone passes around a beverage made from fermented grain. Someone else offers dried fish. A child falls asleep against her mother's shoulder. The fire burns down slowly, and people gradually drift away to their houses. You spend another night by the lake, and in the morning you decide to continue your journey. The trail leads away from the shore, heading toward a range of low hills visible in the distance. The lake settlement waits to see you off, though there's no formal goodbye. A few people nod. The man who gave you fish the first day hands you a bundle of dried fish for your journey. The older man making quipu raises a hand in farewell. Then you're walking, following the trail away from the water. The landscape changes as you leave the lake behind. The marshy vegetation gives way to drier plants. Tough grasses, scattered bushes, occasional trees twisted by constant wind. The trail is less clear here, marked more by occasional rock cairns than by an obvious path. You have to pay attention to stay en route. By midday you've reached the hills. They're not particularly high, but they're steep and rocky, with dramatic outcroppings that provide shelter from the wind. You find one of these outcroppings and rest in its shade, eating some of the dried fish and watching the landscape. From this vantage point you can see back toward the lake, though it's distant now, just a silver gleam on the horizon. In the opposite direction, the land stretches away in shades of brown and tan, with occasional green lines marking watercourses. It's big country, and empty in the way that landscapes are empty when humans use them but don't dominate them. There are no cities here, no roads, no visible settlements, but that doesn't mean the land is unused or unknown. Those watercourses are named. Those distant hills are recognised landmarks. People know this territory intimately, even if they don't live in it densely. You continue walking through the afternoon. The trail descends into a broad valley where a river cuts through red rock, exposing geological layers that record millions of years. The rock walls are covered with images, hands, spirals, animal figures, geometric patterns. Some are painted, others are carved. The images span what must be centuries, with older, faded figures overlaid by newer, sharper ones. This place has been important for a very long time. The images aren't random or purely artistic. Many of them mark specific locations: a river crossing, a cave that provides shelter, a spring with reliable water. Others record events, a successful hunt, a gathering of many groups, an astronomical observation. Still others seem to be symbolic or spiritual, marking this place as significant in ways that go beyond practical navigation. You walk slowly through this outdoor gallery, trying to understand what you're seeing. Some meanings are obvious. A row of human figures with elaborate headdresses probably represents a ceremony or important gathering. A spiral with dots around it might be recording an astronomical event, a solar eclipse perhaps, or the appearance of a comet. Other images are more cryptic. What does that handprint mean? Or that series of parallel lines? Or that abstract pattern that doesn't seem to represent anything in the physical world? The truth is, you can't fully understand these images without the cultural context that created them. They're messages, but they're messages encoded in a system you don't fully know. Someone from this culture could probably read them easily, could tell you exactly what each image means and who made it and when. But that information isn't accessible to you. It's a reminder that all communication requires shared knowledge. Writing seems universal once you know the alphabet, but it's really just another code, another system that has to be learned. The sun is getting low, painting the red rock even redder. You find a place to camp near the river, where the sound of water provides a constant, soothing background. You build a fire and prepare a simple meal, then sit watching the last light fade from the sky. The stars here are extraordinary. With no artificial light for hundreds of miles, the Milky Way is so bright it casts shadows. You lie on your back and watch the sky, trying to identify patterns. That bright star there, is it the same star that guides sailors at sea? That cluster, is it the same one that tells farmers when to plant? The stars are consistent, which makes them reliable. They're the same for everyone who looks up at the night sky, regardless of language or culture. In that sense, they're the most universal communication system humans have ever had. You sleep deeply and wake at first light. The river is loud in the morning stillness, and the red rock walls catch the sunrise, glowing briefly before the light becomes general and ordinary. You pack up and continue downstream, following the river as it cuts through progressively deeper canyons. By late morning, you hear something that stops you. Voices. Not many, and not close, but definitely human voices somewhere ahead. You continue more cautiously, and soon you see smoke rising from a canyon side branch. You approach carefully and find a group of maybe 20 people camped near a spring. They notice you at about the same time you notice them. There's a moment of assessment on both sides. Then one of the men in the group raises his hand in greeting, palm forward, the same gesture you've seen elsewhere on this journey. You return the gesture and approach slowly, hands visible and empty. What follows is a wordless negotiation. The man who greeted you gestures toward the camp, then toward you, with an expression that clearly asks, "Where are you travelling?" You point downstream, then up at the sun, trying to indicate a journey of some duration. He nods, understanding, then gestures toward the fire and makes eating motions. The invitation is clear: share their food, rest here. You accept, and for the next few hours, you're part of this group. You learn their names through repetition and pointing. You share your dried fish, which is received with apparent appreciation. You help gather firewood, which requires no explanation. Everyone understands this task. A woman offers you water from the spring in a beautifully made clay vessel. A child shows you a collection of interesting rocks, and you admire them with appropriate enthusiasm. Communication happens constantly, but almost none of it is verbal. When the group prepares to move on, you understand through gestures and the general gathering of belongings. When they indicate you're welcome to travel with them for a while, you understand through nods and the way they adjust their pace to include you. When you eventually part ways, them heading toward the hills, you continuing downstream, the farewell involves clasping forearms, a gesture that feels both formal and genuine. You walk on alone, thinking about what just happened. An entire social interaction occurred with minimal spoken language. Information was exchanged, hospitality was offered and accepted, cooperation happened, relationships were acknowledged, all through gesture, expression, and shared understanding of basic human needs and courtesies. In some ways, it was more efficient than conversation would have been. There was no room for misunderstanding, no ambiguity hidden in words. Everything was clear and direct. The river eventually leads you out of the canyon country and into more open terrain. The landscape here is grassland, rolling away to distant horizons. You can see weather systems from miles away, a thunderstorm moving across the land like a dark wall, rain falling in visible curtains that never quite reach your position. The storm passes to the north, and in its wake a rainbow appears, perfect and bright against the dark sky. You walk for days through this grassland, following paths that are sometimes clear and sometimes barely visible. You encounter occasional groups of travellers, and each encounter follows a similar pattern. Cautious approach, assessment, exchange of basic information through gesture, sharing of resources if appropriate, then separation. It strikes you that this might be the most common form of human communication for most of history. Brief encounters with strangers, mediated through a common language of gesture and shared understanding. The grassland gradually transitions to scrubland and then to forest. The forest is dense and dim, with massive trees that must be centuries old. The trail here is more defined, worn deep into the soil by countless feet over countless years. You follow it through the green dimness, listening to bird calls and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. You emerge from the forest in late afternoon and find yourself looking down at a broad river valley. The valley floor is cultivated, divided into fields that show different stages of growth. Villages are scattered along the river, connected by visible paths. It's a more densely populated landscape than anything you've seen on this journey, evidence of a larger, more complex society. You descend into the valley as the sun sets, and by the time you reach the first village, it's nearly dark. The village is larger than the lake settlement, but smaller than the mountain town. Houses are arranged in a rough circle around a central area where a large fire burns. People are gathering near the fire, and as you approach, you're noticed. An older man approaches you, the elder probably, or at least someone with authority. He speaks, but the language is unfamiliar. You shake your head to indicate you don't understand, and he switches to gesture, asking the same questions the canyon travellers asked. Where are you from? Where are you going? What do you need? You respond with the same gestures, pointing back the way you came, then toward the horizon, then making sleeping and eating gestures. He nods and leads you toward the fire. The villagers make room, and someone hands you a bowl of stew made with unfamiliar vegetables and some kind of grain. It's good, filling, exactly what you need after a long day of walking. As you eat, you observe the gathering. This is clearly a regular occurrence. This evening assembly around the fire. People are relaxed, talking in small groups, while children play at the edges of the firelight. Occasionally someone stands and addresses the whole group, speaking at some length while others listen. You can't understand the words, but you can guess the function. These are community announcements, news being shared, decisions being made collectively. One speaker is a young woman who talks animatedly, gesturing toward the fields. She's probably reporting on crop conditions or discussing planting strategies. Another speaker is an older man who speaks more slowly, with long pauses during which people nod or murmur agreement. He's probably discussing something that requires community consensus, a building project perhaps, or the resolution of a dispute. After several speakers have finished, someone brings out a drum and begins playing a simple rhythm. Others join in, some with drums, others with rattles, others with their voices, singing or chanting in a way that blends with the percussion. It's not quite music and not quite speech, but something in between. a form of collective expression that seems to serve both social and possibly spiritual functions. You sit and listen, feeling the rhythm work its way into your body. The beat is infectious, making it hard to sit still. Some people are dancing now, moving around the fire with steps that seem both spontaneous and choreographed, individual and communal. The whole village is participating in some way, playing, singing, dancing, or just watching and swaying to the rhythm. The drumming continues for perhaps an hour, then gradually winds down. People disperse to their homes and someone shows you to a guest house, a small structure on the edge of the village where travellers can sleep. It's simple but comfortable, with woven mats on the floor and a small fire pit in the centre. You lie down, exhausted but not quite ready for sleep. The events of the day replay in your mind: the canyon meeting, the grassland crossing, the forest walk, this village gathering. Each place has had its own forms of communication, its own methods of sharing information and building community. But certain patterns repeat everywhere. The use of gesture, the importance of fire as a gathering point, the role of rhythm in creating shared experience, the offering of hospitality to travellers. You sleep deeply and wake to the sound of the village coming to life. People are already working in the fields when you emerge from the guest house. Someone hands you a bowl of grain porridge and a piece of fruit. The elder from last night approaches and, through gesture, asks if you'll stay another day. The invitation is tempting, but you indicate you need to continue your journey. He nods understanding and gives you a bundle of food for the road. Dried meat, grain cakes, some kind of preserved fruit. You leave the village as the sun climbs higher, following the river downstream. The valley continues for many miles, with villages appearing every few hours. You don't stop at most of them, just wave to people working in the fields or children playing near the river. Each wave is returned, a simple acknowledgement that you're a fellow human, entitled to safe passage through the territory. By late afternoon, you notice the river widening. The current slows. The water takes on a brackish smell. You're approaching the coast. The coast, when you reach it, is dramatic. The river empties into a wide bay protected by rocky headlands. The beach is black sand, volcanic, with tide pools full of strange and colourful life. The air smells of salt and kelp. Seabirds wheel overhead, calling in harsh voices that carry on the wind. There's a fishing village on the bay. The house is built on stilts above the high tide line. People are working with nets, repairing boats, processing fish. The scale of operation here is larger than the lake fishing you saw earlier. These boats are built for ocean travel, sturdy and seaworthy, capable of venturing miles from shore. You walk along the beach, watching the villagers work. A group of men is launching a boat through the surf, timing their push to match the rhythm of the waves. They make it through the break zone and begin paddling toward deeper water. Within minutes, they're small figures against the enormous ocean. The ocean itself is a barrier and a highway simultaneously. It separates lands but also connects them. People have been using it for transportation and communication for thousands of years, island hopping across vast distances, navigating by stars and wave patterns and the flight paths of birds. The knowledge required for ocean navigation is profound and subtle, passed down through generations of careful teaching and observation. You notice something on the beach, a large piece of driftwood carved with symbols and images. It's not local work. The wood is from a tree species that doesn't grow here, and the carving style is unfamiliar. Someone else has carved a response next to the original images. A different hand, a different style, but clearly in dialogue with the first set of carvings. This driftwood is a message that travelled by ocean current, washing up here from some distant shore, and someone local has responded, sending a message back out with the next tide, hoping it will reach whoever sent the original. The sun is setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The fishing boats are returning, racing to get through the surf before full dark. You watch them come in, timing their approach, riding the waves with skill that looks easy but clearly isn't. One by one they beach successfully and the crews begin unloading their catch. You stay at the fishing village for 3 days, watching how this community operates. The work is harder here than in the agricultural villages. The ocean is dangerous and unpredictable. But the rewards can be greater too. On a good day, the boats return loaded with fish. On a bad day, they might return empty, or not return at all. Everyone understands the risk. Communication is essential here. Before the boats go out, the crews discuss weather signs, the colour of the sky, the behaviour of birds, the feel of the wind. information is shared freely because everyone's safety depends on good collective judgment. When the boats return, the catch is distributed through a complex system that accounts for who took what risks, who contributed what labour, but also ensures that everyone in the village has enough to eat. You help with some of the shore work, mending nets, gathering firewood, processing fish for drying. The work requires no explanation. People show you what to do once, and then you do it. Your contribution is accepted without comment, just as your presence has been accepted. This is how stranger integration works in these communities. You participate, you contribute, you become temporarily part of the social fabric. On your last evening at the village, there's another gathering around a central fire. This one feels different, more formal, more purposeful. An elder stands and begins speaking, and though you can't understand the words, you recognise the cadence and rhythm of storytelling. She's recounting a narrative, something long and complex, with different voices for different characters, with dramatic pauses and emphatic gestures. The story goes on for perhaps an hour, and the audience is completely engaged, laughing at funny parts, murmuring seriously at tense moments, repeating certain phrases in unison. This is clearly a story everyone knows, has heard many times before, but it never gets old. The repetition is the point. This is how the story is preserved, how it's passed to the next generation, how it continues to exist in a world without writing. When the storyteller finishes, there's a moment of silence, and then conversation resumes. People discuss the story, debate interpretations, talk about what it means and why it matters. The story isn't static. It lives and changes through these discussions, through different tellers emphasising different aspects, through the community's ongoing engagement with it. You leave the fishing village the next morning following the coast north. The beach gives way to rocky cliffs, and the trail climbs away from the water, offering spectacular views of the ocean below. You can see the curvature of the earth out there, the way the ocean meets the sky in a gentle arc. The trail eventually turns inland, climbing into hills covered with dense forest. The forest here is different from the one you passed through earlier, wetter, greener, with moss covering everything and streams running through deep ravines. The air is thick with moisture and the smell of decay and growth happening simultaneously. You walk for days through this forest, following trails that are sometimes clear and sometimes barely detectable. You encounter other travellers occasionally, and each time the same ritual occurs: cautious approach, assessment, brief exchange of information, then continuation on separate paths. No one is hostile, no one is particularly friendly either. It's just neutral acknowledgement that you both have business in this forest and are entitled to go about it. The forest eventually thins, and you find yourself in hill country again. Not mountains exactly, but substantial rolling terrain with steep valleys and high ridges. The vegetation is sparse here, mostly grass and low shrubs, with occasional twisted trees in sheltered spots. You're tired now. The journey has been long, and you're running low on supplies. When you see smoke rising from a valley ahead, you decide to investigate, hoping for another village where you can rest and resupply. The village, when you reach it, is smaller than most you've encountered, maybe 50 people. The houses are built partly into the hillside, using the earth itself as insulation. People emerge to watch as you approach, but they don't seem alarmed. An older woman steps forward and greets you with the palm-forward gesture you've seen throughout this journey. You're welcomed and fed. You're given a place to sleep, and for several days you rest here, recovering your strength. The village is quiet, self-contained, operating on rhythms determined by season and weather and the needs of the small herd of animals they keep. Life here is simple but sufficient. No one seems to lack for anything essential. One evening, sitting by the fire with several villagers, you try to explain where you've been, where you're going. You use gestures and drawings in the dirt, a map of sorts showing mountains and rivers and the ocean. The villagers nod, understanding some of it, looking puzzled at other parts. One man takes a stick and adds to your drawing, indicating places he knows, correcting your geography where it doesn't match the territory as he understands it. It strikes you that this is how maps get made, how knowledge of territory gets built up and refined, through many people contributing what they know, correcting errors, adding details. The map in the dirt is crude, but it's accurate where it matters. It shows water sources, mountain passes, places to avoid. It's functional knowledge, shared freely because everyone benefits when everyone knows the landscape. You leave the hill village after a week, heading toward what your dirt map indicates as a major river valley. The hills gradually descend and the vegetation becomes richer. You start seeing cultivated fields again, signs of larger populations. The river valley, when you reach it, is extensive and obviously prosperous. The river itself is huge, brown and powerful, carrying snowmelt from distant mountains. Villages line both banks, connected by ferries and simple bridges. Fields stretch away from the river in carefully maintained patterns. You follow the river downstream for many days, stopping at different villages, each with its own character and specialisation. One village is known for pottery. You see finished vessels stacked everywhere, ready for trade. Another specialises in textiles, with looms operating in most houses. A third focuses on metalwork, producing tools and decorative objects from copper and bronze. Trade happens constantly. Boats move up and down the river carrying goods and people. Traders arrive from distant regions, bringing exotic items that generate excitement and long negotiations. The river is a communication network and an economic network simultaneously, enabling both information exchange and material exchange. You notice that certain symbols appear repeatedly in this valley, marked on vessels, carved into doorposts, painted on boat hulls. The symbols seem to indicate ownership or origin, a proto-writing system that isn't quite full writing yet, but serves some of the same functions. This pot came from that village. This boat belongs to this family. The symbols are simple and limited in what they can communicate, but within their narrow scope they work perfectly. The river eventually widens dramatically. The current slows. The water takes on that brackish quality that indicates proximity to the ocean. You're approaching another coast, completing a circuit that has taken you across mountains and grasslands, through forests and along rivers, from ocean to ocean. The delta where the river meets the sea is a maze of channels and islands, some permanent, others shifting with the tides. People here live on the islands, building houses on stilts, travelling everywhere by boat. The lifestyle is completely adapted to this amphibious environment. You spend your last days here, watching the tides come and go, watching boats navigate the complex channels with practiced ease. The boats carry messages in the form of goods. This island produces salt, that one produces fish, another grows vegetables in raised beds. The exchange of goods is also an exchange of information about conditions, about needs, about opportunities. On your final evening, you sit on a beach watching the sun set over the ocean. The delta spreads out behind you, a complex working landscape that supports thousands of people without any written records, any formal bureaucracy, any of the infrastructure that later civilizations will consider essential. But it works. Information flows through gesture and symbol. Knowledge persists through oral tradition and practical demonstration. Communities coordinate through shared understanding and face-to-face negotiation. The system has limitations, certainly. Information can't travel faster than a person can walk or a boat can sail. Memory can fail. Knowledge can be lost when elders die. But within those limitations, the system functions remarkably well. The sun touches the horizon. The water turns gold, then orange, then red. The light fades slowly, gently, leaving the world in soft twilight. Stars begin to appear, the same stars that have guided every traveller, every navigator, every night observer throughout human history. You think about writing, about the revolution it will bring when it arrives. Written language will enable things these communities can't imagine. Large-scale bureaucracy, literature that outlives its author, precise legal codes, scientific notation, historical records that extend back centuries. But writing will also change something fundamental about human communication. The directness of face-to-face exchange will give way to the abstraction of text. The flexibility of oral tradition will be replaced by the fixity of written documents. The democratic accessibility of gesture and symbol will narrow to those who can master alphabets and grammar. Neither system is simply better or worse. They're different tools serving different purposes. These pre-literate communities have developed sophisticated methods of communication that serve their needs perfectly. Writing will add new capabilities but also new complexities. The last light fades from the sky. The delta becomes a collection of scattered lights, cooking fires on the islands, signal fires on channel markers, the bioluminescence of tiny creatures in the water. Each light is a point of human activity, a node in the vast network of communication that spans this entire landscape. You lie back on the sand and watch the stars emerge. The Milky Way becomes visible, that river of light that looks almost liquid against the dark sky. The stars are fixed, unchanging, reliable. They've been there for every human who has ever looked up at the night sky, and they'll be there for every human who ever will. The sound of the waves is rhythmic, hypnotic. The breeze is cool but not cold. The sand is still warm from the day's sun. You close your eyes and listen to the ocean, to the vast breathing rhythm of water and shore, and you think about all the messages that have travelled across this world, carried by runners, drummed through valleys, signalled with smoke and fire, encoded in knots and symbols, remembered in stories and songs, demonstrated in the making of things and the doing of work. All of it is communication. All of it is human. All of it happens without writing, and all of it works. The tide is coming in. You can hear it advancing across the delta, filling channels, lifting boats, bringing salt water into fresh. The sound is peaceful, inexorable, part of a cycle that predates humans and will continue long after humans are gone. You drift towards sleep, thinking about cycles, the tide, the seasons, the stars wheeling overhead. In the morning, you'll wake to low tide and new light. But for now, there's just this. The soft sound of water, the cool air, the dark sky, the vast, quiet world continuing its ancient patterns while you rest on its shore. The messages will continue. The drums will sound in distant valleys. The signal fires will burn on hilltops. The runners will carry their knotted cords along mountain trails. The oral historians will recite genealogies and stories. The symbols will mark ownership and origin. The gifts will flow through communities, creating bonds of reciprocity and trust. All of it will continue, this vast web of communication that spans the world, invisible to anyone who doesn't know how to see it, but perfectly clear to those who do. The ocean breathes, the stars turn, the world continues, and you sleep. My tired sleep buddies, if this journey through the quiet architecture of ancient communication has helped you drift toward rest, I'd be grateful if you'd give this video a gentle thumbs up or subscribe to keep these stories coming. Until next time, sleep well. There is a kind of silence that only exists before the world starts writing things down. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything happening quietly, without leaving a mark on paper. It is the silence of 1,000 generations of people who lived full lives, built communities, loved each other, argued about the weather, buried their dead, and celebrated the return of spring, all of which left almost no written record. This is where our story begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a war or a conquest or the fall of a great city. It begins with that silence, with the long, slow, unhurried stretch of time before someone decided that thoughts needed to be pinned down with ink. And here is the thing that most people do not realise, the thing that makes this entire story so quietly extraordinary, that silence was not an accident. It was not a failure. It was not a sign that these people had nothing worth saying. It was a choice. A deliberate, careful, deeply considered choice made by some of the most thoughtful people who ever lived on this earth. And once you understand why they made that choice, once you truly sit with the reasoning behind it, the entire history of the ancient Celts begins to look less like a mystery and more like something that was always there, waiting to be understood on its terms rather than on ours. So settle in. Let the night come around you. Let the sounds of the world outside grow quiet and distant. We're going to move through this story slowly, the way these ancient people themselves moved through the world, with attention, with care, and with a great deal of patience. Imagine the landscape of Europe roughly 2,500 years ago. Not the Europe of highways and city grids and satellite maps, but the older Europe. The Europe of dense forest and open meadow, of rivers that had not yet been dammed or straightened, of hills that rose and fell in long, unbroken waves of green. The air was different then, cleaner in ways we can barely comprehend now. The stars at night were a blaze of white across a sky that no electric light had ever interrupted. The people who lived across this landscape, stretching from what we now call Ireland all the way east, to the plains of modern-day Turkey and south into the warmth of the Iberian Peninsula, were not one single nation. They did not call themselves Celts. That word came later, applied by Greek and Roman writers who were trying to make sense of peoples they did not fully understand. But these scattered communities shared something remarkable. They shared a way of seeing the world, a common thread of language, of belief, and of social organisation tied them together across thousands of miles of varied terrain. And the first thing you need to understand about them, the very first thing, is that they were not backward. They were not primitive. They were not a lesser version of the Greeks and Romans who wrote about them. They were simply different, profoundly, intentionally different. And that difference is at the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight. The Greeks and Romans, for all their extraordinary achievements in philosophy and engineering and law, were cultures that believed in writing things down. They believed that knowledge lived on paper, that if something was not recorded, it was somehow less real, less permanent, and less worthy of being remembered. This was their lens, and it was the lens through which they looked at every other civilization they encountered. When they looked at the Celts, they saw a people with no books, no written histories, no libraries. And through their particular lens, this looked like absence. It looked like lack. It looked like people who had nothing to say or who had not yet figured out how to say it. But what if it was the opposite? What if the Celts looked at the Greek and Roman obsession with writing and saw something dangerous, something that could weaken the mind rather than strengthen it? What if their silence, their beautiful and deliberate silence, was actually one of the most sophisticated intellectual decisions any ancient civilization ever made? Let us sit with that idea for a moment. Let it settle. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Not to sleep, not yet, but simply to imagine what it would have felt like to live in a world without books, without newspapers, without the constant murmur of written language surrounding you at every turn. A world where the only way to learn something was to find someone who already knew it, and to sit with them, and to listen. A world where knowledge had a voice, a breath, and a warmth, where it could only be given from one living person to another, the way a flame can only be passed from one candle to the next. That world was not so long ago, in the deep measure of human time. And for the Celts, it was not simply the world they happened to live in. It was the world they actively chose to preserve. The Greeks had a word for it. They called the Celts' way of passing knowledge through spoken language and memorized verse and oral tradition. And they recorded this, because of course they did, with a mixture of fascination and something close to bemusement. The historian Strabo wrote about Celtic scholars who spent years, sometimes as many as 19 years, in a state of study that was almost monastic in its dedication. Julius Caesar himself, in his accounts of his campaigns in what is now France, noted that the Celtic priests, the people we have come to call Druids, refused to commit their teachings to writing even though they were perfectly capable of it. This is a crucial detail. Caesar did not say the Celts could not write. He said they chose not to. There is a world of difference between those two statements, and most people, when they first encounter this history, gloss right past it. So why? Why would an intelligent, sophisticated people deliberately refuse to write down their most important knowledge? The answer, when you begin to piece it together from the scattered references left by Greek and Roman writers, and from the archaeological evidence, and from the deep wells of Celtic myth and poetry that survived in Ireland and Wales in later centuries, is both practical and philosophical. It touches on questions about how memory works, about the relationship between a person and the land they live on, and about what happens to knowledge when you remove it from the living context in which it was meant to exist. The first reason was about the nature of memory itself. The Celts, and many other cultures around the world who practiced oral tradition, understood something about the human mind that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. They understood that knowledge that is memorized through repetition, through rhythm, through song, or through story is not stored the same way as knowledge that is simply read from a page. Memorized knowledge becomes part of you. It lives in your body as much as it lives in your mind. It is connected to emotion, to breath, and to the act of speaking aloud to another person. It is alive in a way that words on a page are not. When a Celtic scholar spent 19 years memorising the teachings of their tradition, they were not simply filling up a mental library, they were transforming themselves. The knowledge was becoming woven into the fabric of their consciousness, inseparable from who they were. And this meant that every time the knowledge was passed on from teacher to student, from elder to young person, from one generation to the next, it was not a copying process. It was a living transmission, a conversation, a relationship. The poetry of the ancient Celts deserves a moment of its own, because it was not simply a form of entertainment or even a form of cultural preservation. It was, in a very real sense, a technology, a sophisticated, carefully developed set of techniques for encoding information in a form that the human memory could hold onto across generations without losing its essential content. Celtic verse forms were extraordinarily complex. The Irish poets, the Fillid, as they were called, were required to master dozens of different meter patterns before they were considered fully trained. These patterns were not arbitrary. They were designed to work with the way the human mind naturally processes and retains rhythmic information. A piece of knowledge encoded in a particular meter, sung or chanted to a particular melody, and repeated at regular intervals over the course of years. That knowledge would take root in the memory in a way that a simple statement of fact never could. Think of how easily you remember a song you heard as a child, how the words come back to you, decades later, unbidden, triggered by a particular melody or a particular rhythm. The Celts understood this capacity of the human mind, and they built their entire system of knowledge transmission around it. The great poems, the origin myths, the genealogies, the histories of the gods and the heroes, were not simply stories told for pleasure. They were repositories. Living libraries were carried in the minds of the poets who had memorized them and passed on, intact, from one generation of poets to the next. The discipline required to become a Celtic poet was immense. The training lasted years. Some accounts say as many as 12 or even 20 years of intensive study. The student learned not only the verse forms and the melodies, but also the entire body of knowledge that the poems contained. Geography, history, law, genealogy, the names and deeds of every significant figure in the community's past, the relationships between places and people and events that gave meaning to the present, all of it, woven into verse, carried in memory, ready to be spoken aloud when the occasion demanded it. This was not a lesser form of intellectual achievement than writing. It was a different form, and in some ways, in the way it demanded total engagement, in the way it kept knowledge alive and responsive to the community that used it, and in the way it maintained a living relationship between the knowledge and the people who carried it, it was arguably a more powerful form. A book can be ignored, a poem that lives in a poet's memory, that will be spoken aloud at the next gathering, that the entire community expects to hear, that knowledge cannot be set aside. It must be attended to. It must be received. Write something down, and it becomes a thing you can point to. A fixed object. Something that can be copied, carried away, stripped of its context, and misunderstood by someone who was never meant to receive it. Keep it in memory. Keep it alive through the act of telling and listening, and it remains tethered to the people and the places and the relationships that gave it meaning. This was not a small consideration. For cultures whose entire worldview was built around the idea that the land, the seasons, the community, and the individual were all part of one continuous breathing system, the idea of knowledge floating free, disconnected from all of that, pinned to a piece of parchment like a butterfly pinned to a board, that would have seemed not just strange but almost violent. And this brings us to the landscapes. If you could fly over ancient Celtic territory in the early morning light, let us say sometime around 500 BCE, when their influence stretched widest across the continent, you would notice something. You would notice that the places where these communities built their most important gathering sites, their sacred spaces, and their places of ceremony and council were not chosen randomly. They were not simply wherever it was convenient to build. They were chosen with extraordinary care, and the criteria for that choice had almost nothing to do with military strategy or trade routes. The Celts chose their sacred landscapes the way a musician chooses a resonant room. They listened to the land. There are places in the world where something seems to happen to the quality of your attention, whether light falls in a particular way, or whether land curves into a shape that makes you stop walking and simply stand there breathing, where water moves over stone in a way that sounds almost like language, where the boundary between sky and earth seems thinner than it does anywhere else. The Celts were extraordinarily sensitive to these places. They found them, and they marked them, and they returned to them generation after generation. Many of these places share certain physical characteristics. They tend to be at points where different landscapes meet, where a forest gives way to open water, where a hilltop drops suddenly into a valley, or where a river bends sharply and creates an island or a peninsula. These are liminal places, threshold places, places where one world seems to bleed into another, and the Celts understood, or perhaps more accurately the Celts felt, that these transitions in the landscape were meaningful, that they corresponded to something real about the nature of the world. The bogs were particularly important, across Ireland, Scotland, Britain, and into the heartlands of continental Celtic territory in France and Germany. The great peat bogs were treated as sacred ground, and not sacred in the way we might casually use that word today, meaning simply important or impressive. Sacred in the sense that they were understood to be a place where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it became extraordinarily thin. Think about what a bog actually is if you've never stood at the edge of one in the early morning when the mist is sitting low on the water. It is a landscape that is neither land nor water. It is solid enough to walk on, but only just. Beneath your feet, the ground is a sponge of decomposed plant matter and dark, tea-coloured water that stretches down into depths you cannot see. The surface moves when you step on it. It trembles. Things that fall into a bog do not disappear. They are preserved. Extraordinarily well preserved, in fact, sometimes for thousands of years. The bog holds what is given to it. The bog bodies themselves, and there are hundreds of them found across Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands, are among the most haunting and most informative artefacts the ancient world has left behind. Preserved by the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of the peat, some of them are so well preserved that you can see the texture of their skin, the contents of their last meal, and the calluses on their hands from years of work. They are, in a sense, the closest we can come to looking at an ancient Celtic person face to face. For decades, the popular narrative surrounding bog bodies focused on violence. Many of them show signs of brutal treatment, stab wounds, broken bones, and ligature marks around the neck. This led to dramatic theories about ritual sacrifice, about offerings to the gods, and about the dark and bloody side of Celtic religion that the Romans had warned us about. And the Romans, of course, were only too happy to have their accounts seemingly confirmed. But more recent scholarship has complicated this picture enormously. Many bog bodies show no signs of violence at all. They are simply people who died, from illness, from accident, from the ordinary causes that have always ended human lives, and whose bodies were placed in the bog with care, with attention, sometimes with grave goods, a cloak, a knife, a piece of food, sometimes with injuries that appear to have been treated and healed over before death came from some other cause entirely. And even the violent deaths, when examined more carefully, do not always support the narrative of brutal ritual killing. Some scholars have suggested that bog bodies may represent a complex range of burial practices, some honourable, some punitive, some somewhere in between, that reflect the full spectrum of how a Celtic community dealt with its dead. The bog was not simply a place of sacrifice. It was a place of transition, a place where the dead were given to the land, returned to the earth in a way that acknowledged the cycle of decay and renewal that the bog itself so perfectly represented. To stand at the edge of a bog and to think about what lies beneath the surface, the layers of compressed vegetation, the slow accumulation of centuries, the bodies and the offerings and the memories of all the people who came here to give something back to the land, is to stand at one of the most profound interfaces between human life and the natural world that exists anywhere on Earth. The bog does not judge. It does not distinguish between the honourable dead and the dishonoured. It simply receives. It simply preserves. It holds what is given to it, and it holds it gently, and it holds it for as long as it needs to. The Celts knew this, and they gave the dogs many things. Weapons, yes, and sometimes bodies. Though the violence sometimes attributed to bog bodies is far more complicated than popular accounts suggest, and we'll come back to that. But also treasures, gold torques and intricate bronze work and beautifully crafted cauldrons that represented enormous wealth and skill. These were not things discarded or lost. They were offerings, gifts given to a place that was understood to exist between worlds. And here is where the conspiracy begins to reveal itself, not as something sinister, but as something quietly magnificent. Because the Romans, when they encountered these sacred landscapes, did not understand them. They could not understand them. Not really, because their entire framework for thinking about the world did not include the possibility that a landscape could be sacred in itself, independent of any god or temple built upon it. The Romans built temples, they placed statues, they imposed their gods onto the land like stamps pressed into wax. The idea that the land itself might already be holy, might already possess a kind of consciousness or significance that predated any human religion, that was a foreign concept. And so when Roman writers described Celtic sacred sites, they described them in Roman terms. They saw ritual, and they called it superstition. They saw reverence, and they called it fear. They saw a complex, nuanced relationship between a people and their landscape, and they simplified it into something they could fit into their own understanding. And the simplification stuck. For centuries, for well over 1,000 years, the story of the Celts was told through Roman eyes. Their sacred landscapes became primitive ritual grounds. Their careful, deliberate relationship with the land became barbaric nature worship. Their silence, their beautiful oral tradition, became evidence of backwardness. But the landscape itself did not change. The bogs are still there. The hilltops are still there. The places where water meets stone in that particular way, where the light does that particular thing in the early morning, those places are still there, and they still do something to the people who visit them. They still make you stop. They still make you breathe a little deeper. They still feel, to anyone who is paying attention, like a place where something important is happening, just below the surface of what you can see. Let the night settle a little deeper around you now. We are moving into the quieter heart of this story. Power. Let us talk about power, because this is where another one of the great Celtic conspiracies, another one of the things that Roman writers got so fundamentally wrong, truly comes into focus. When most people think about ancient societies, they think about kings, they think about pyramids of authority, with one person at the top and everyone else below. This is such a deeply ingrained assumption in Western thinking that we often project it onto cultures where it did not actually exist. We assume that every ancient society had a single ruler, a supreme leader, someone who held all the power and made all the decisions. And when we look at the Celts, we look for that person. We look for the king, the chief, the supreme authority. But the picture that emerges when you look carefully at the evidence, not just the Roman accounts, but the Irish and Welsh myths that preserve so much of Celtic social structure, and the archaeological record of how Celtic communities actually lived, the picture is much more interesting than a simple hierarchy. Much more interesting and much more subtle. Celtic society was, in many ways, a society built on negotiation, on consensus, on a web of relationships and obligations that distributed power so thoroughly that no single person could ever accumulate too much of it without the whole web beginning to vibrate in protest. The Irish myths, and these myths, though written down in the early medieval period by Christian monks, preserve remarkably detailed information about pre-Christian Irish social customs, are full of kings who are not really kings in the way we understand the word. They are figures who hold a particular role, yes, but that role is bounded by obligations so extensive and so carefully defined that it functions almost as much as a form of service as it does as a form of authority. There is the concept of the sacred king, the king whose personal well-being is tied to the prosperity of the land. If the king is virtuous, the crops grow well. If the king fails in his duties, the land itself begins to wither. This is not simply a metaphor in the myths. It is presented as a literal physical truth. The king is not above the land. He is part of it. His power does not come from conquest or wealth or military force. It comes from his relationship with the earth, and that relationship can be broken. And there are rules, so many rules. The Irish myths are full of what are called geasa, singular gaze, which are essentially sacred prohibitions placed on individuals, often on kings. A king might be forbidden from eating a particular food, or from travelling in a particular direction on a particular day, or from refusing hospitality to a stranger. These prohibitions might seem arbitrary to a modern reader, but they functioned as a kind of check on power. They reminded the person who held authority that their authority was conditional, that it could be taken away, that they were answerable not just to their community, but to the land itself, and to the deep, old, invisible forces that the land represented. This is not the picture of power that the Romans painted. The Romans saw Celtic warriors and Celtic leaders, and they saw something that looked, to Roman eyes, like a familiar structure, a chieftain with warriors beneath him, like a rougher, less civilized version of a Roman general. They did not see, or if they saw, they did not understand, the vast invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity and sacred duty that actually held Celtic society together. And because the Romans did not see it, they did not write about it. And because they did not write about it, it disappeared from the historical record. For centuries, the Celtic world looked, to anyone reading the available sources, like a collection of warlike tribes ruled by ambitious chieftains, simple, brutal, easily understood through a Roman lens. But the myths survived, passed down at first through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always relied on, and then, eventually, written down by monks in Ireland who were trying to preserve something they sensed was valuable, even if they no longer fully understood its original context. And when scholars began to read those myths carefully, really carefully, paying attention not just to the dramatic stories but to the social details embedded within them, they began to see the shape of a society that was far more sophisticated, far more thoughtful in its organisation than anyone had given it credit for. Power, shared, not hoarded, not concentrated, distributed through a web of relationships so intricate and so carefully maintained that it looked, from the outside, almost invisible, almost like no one was in charge at all. But everyone was. Everyone, in their own way, in their own sphere, held a piece of it, and the system worked, quietly, sustainably, without the constant upheaval that comes when power is held by too few hands. Now, the Romans. We cannot tell this story without spending some time with the Romans, because it was the Romans who did more than anyone else to shape the way we think about the Celts. And what they did, unintentionally for the most part, was to replace a complex, layered reality with a much simpler story. A story that served Roman purposes, even if those purposes were not always consciously articulated. Julius Caesar invaded what is now France, which the Romans called Gaul, in 58 BCE. It was an extraordinarily bloody campaign, and the Romans won, and when it was over, Caesar wrote about it. His writings, the Gallic Wars, are one of our primary sources for understanding the Celts of that era. And they are fascinating documents, partly because Caesar was a genuinely brilliant observer, and partly because he was also a politician with a very specific audience in mind. He was writing for Rome. He was writing to justify his campaigns, to demonstrate his military genius, and to present the peoples he had conquered in a way that made his conquest seem necessary and impressive. To do that, He needed the Celts to be a certain kind of enemy, brave enough to be worthy opponents. Caesar was not interested in boasting about defeating a rabble, but also different enough, strange enough, that conquering them seemed like a civilizing act, a bringing of order to chaos, a bringing of light to darkness. So Caesar wrote about Celtic human sacrifice. He wrote about the Druids burning people alive inside giant wicker structures shaped like men, the famous wicker man. He wrote about society that was, in his telling, simultaneously impressive and horrifying, sophisticated enough to have priests and philosophers, but savage enough to demand blood. Now, how much of this was true? The honest answer is we do not know for certain. Caesar was not the only Roman writer to describe Celtic rituals, and there is some consistency across sources about certain practices. But there is also a very well-established pattern, documented by scholars who have studied this question carefully, of Roman writers borrowing descriptions from one another, embellishing details, and filtering everything through a lens that made Celtic practices look as alien and frightening as possible. The Wicker Man, for instance. Caesar describes it. Other writers repeat the description, but no one has ever found archaeological evidence of a Wicker Man structure being used for mass burning. What archaeologists have found in bog deposits and ritual sites across Celtic territory is something much more nuanced. Offerings. Sacrifices, yes, in some cases, but sacrifice understood in a very different way than the Romans presented it. Not as a spectacle of horror, but as an exchange. A gift given to the land, to the gods, to the invisible forces that sustained life. A gift that was sometimes, tragically, a human life, but embedded in a context of meaning and relationship that the Roman accounts strip away entirely. This is what happens when one civilization writes the history of another. The details that matter most to the people living the experience, the meaning, the context, the web of belief and obligation that surrounds any act, those details are the first things to be lost. What remains is the surface, the dramatic image, the thing that can be understood quickly and used to support a particular narrative. And the narrative the Romans built around the Celts was remarkably durable. It lasted for centuries. It shaped how medieval European scholars thought about the pre-Roman peoples of their continent. It shaped how Renaissance writers imagined the ancient world. It shaped, to a degree that is only now beginning to be fully understood, how we think about the Celts today. But here is the thing about durable narratives. They are durable precisely because they are simple, and simple stories, no matter how well told, always leave something out. The Romans left out the oral tradition. They left out the sacred landscapes. They left out the subtle architecture of shared power. They left out the philosophy. They left out the poetry. They left out everything that could not be seen from the outside, everything that lived in the silence between words, and everything that required years of patient listening to understand. They left out, in other words, almost everything that mattered most. Let the breath come slow now. We're moving into the deepest part of the story, the part where the threads begin to come together. Truth preserved through memory, through myth, through the long, patient act of telling and retelling, generation after generation, until the stories become so worn smooth by repetition that they feel less like stories and more like the shape of the world itself. This is what happened to Celtic knowledge after the Roman conquest. It did not disappear. It did not vanish into oblivion. It went underground. It went into the stories. It went into the poems and the songs and the seasonal rituals that communities continued to practice long after the Romans had built their roads and their forts and their temples across Celtic territory. The Romans could conquer the land. They could tax the people. They could impose their language, their laws, and their gods. But they could not reach into the memory of an elder sitting by a fire on a winter evening, telling a story to the children gathered around her. They could not silence the songs that were sung at the turning points of the year, at the moments when the sun reached its lowest point, or the harvest came in, or the first frost touched the fields. They could not erase the deep embodied knowledge that Celtic communities carried in their bodies, in their hands, and in their understanding of the land they lived on. And so, the knowledge survived, changed certainly, adapted undoubtedly, mixed with Roman customs and later with Christian beliefs as centuries passed, but surviving, persisting, holding its shape in the way that water holds its shape, flowing around obstacles, finding new channels, but never losing its essential nature. The Irish myths are perhaps the most extraordinary example of this survival. Written down beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries CE by monks in Irish monasteries, these myths preserve stories that scholars believe originated centuries earlier, some of them possibly in the pre-Roman period, carried forward through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always practiced. The monks who wrote them down did not always understand what they were preserving. They added Christian framing, reinterpreted pagan figures as historical kings, and softened some of the stranger and more unsettling elements. But the bones of the stories remained. The deep structure, the assumptions about how the world worked, about the relationship between people and land, and about the nature of power and obligation and the sacred. And when scholars began to read these myths not as simple entertainment, not as quaint folk tales, but as encoded repositories of an entire civilization's understanding of itself, that is when the real work of rediscovery began. Consider the Tuatha De Danann, one of the great mythological races in Irish tradition. They are described as beings of extraordinary beauty and power who came to Ireland in the distant past, bringing with them 4 treasures: a spear, a sword, a stone, and a cauldron. They ruled Ireland for a time before being displaced by another group, the Milesians, who are understood to represent the arrival of the historical Irish. But the Tuatha De Danann did not leave Ireland when they were displaced. They retreated into the hills, into the hollow mountains, into the fairy mounds, the Sid, which are in many cases real places in the Irish landscape. Real hills, real burial mounds, and real ancient sites that still exist today. Now, a modern scholar reading this myth casually might see a simple displacement narrative. One group arrives, another group leaves. The departing group becomes supernatural beings who live beneath the earth. Straightforward enough. But read it more carefully. Pay attention to the details. The Tuatha De Danann did not really leave. They went beneath the surface. They are still there, in the hills, in the land itself. And the myths are full of moments where the boundary between their world and the human world becomes permeable. At certain times of year, particularly at Samhain, the festival at the end of October that marked the Celtic New Year, the doors of the Sid open and the Tuatha De Danann can be seen. They can interact with humans. The worlds overlap. What is this, if not a mythological expression of the Celtic understanding that the land is alive, that the landscape contains layers of meaning and presence that go deeper than what the human eye can see, that the relationship between a people and their territory is not simply a matter of living on the land, but of living with it, alongside it, in a continuous conversation that spans generations and crosses boundaries that we, in our modern, rational framework, have convinced ourselves do not exist. The 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann have been the subject of scholarly analysis for over a century. Some researchers have connected them to ritual objects found in archaeological digs across Celtic territory. The cauldron in particular appears again and again in Celtic contexts, a vessel of abundance, of transformation, of communal gathering. The famous cauldron of Dagda, belonging to one of the great gods of Irish myth, is described as never being empty, as feeding the hungry, and as being large enough to hold the entire world. This is not simply a fairy tale detail. It is an expression of a value, a belief that abundance is not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, that the purpose of power, of any kind of power, whether it belongs to a god or a king or a community, is to nourish. And this brings us back to the question of power, back to the quiet conspiracy at the heart of Celtic civilization. The conspiracy that was never really a conspiracy at all, but simply a way of organising human life that the Romans did not understand, and that our own civilization, with its emphasis on individual achievement and centralised authority, has largely forgotten. The night is deepening now. Let the words come to you like water, like the slow movement of a stream over smooth stones. There is no urgency here, no rush. The story will unfold at its own pace, the way it always has, the way it was always meant to. There is a place in County Clare, on the west coast of Ireland, called the Burren. It is one of the strangest landscapes in Europe. The ground is made almost entirely of limestone, pale grey and fractured into a maze of cracks and crevices called grikes. And between the grikes, in the thin soil that collects there, extraordinary flowers grow. Arctic plants and alpine plants and Mediterranean plants, all growing side by side because the microclimate created by the limestone is so unusual that species that would normally be separated by thousands of miles of latitude find themselves neighbours here. The Burren has been inhabited for a very long time, longer than most people realise. There are megalithic tombs here that date back over 5,000 years. Great stone structures built by people whose names we will never know, for purposes we can only guess at. And there are traces, in the landscape itself, of a relationship between humans and this strange, beautiful, inhospitable place that goes back even further than that. The Romans barely touched the Burren. It was too remote, too rocky, and too strange to bother conquering. And so it was left largely alone. And the people who lived there continued to live there in ways that had not changed enormously in a very long time. They continued to know the land the way their ancestors had known it, not as a map, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living system of which they were a part. Walk through the Burren today, in the early morning, when the light is coming in low and golden from the west, and you can feel something of what the Celts must have felt when they stood in their sacred places, a sense of being watched, not by anything hostile or frightening, but by something ancient and patient and vast, a sense that the land is aware of you in its own slow geological way, that it has been watching people walk across it for millennia, and that it will continue to watch long after you're gone. This is not mysticism, or rather it is mysticism only if you define mysticism as any experience that falls outside the narrow range of what modern Western rationality considers acceptable. The Celts would not have called it mysticism. They would have called it paying attention. They would have called it being present in a place, really present, with all your senses open and your assumptions quiet. And this is perhaps the deepest truth that the Celtic conspiracies reveal. The deepest thing that was always there, waiting to be understood, beneath the layers of Roman misinterpretation and centuries of cultural amnesia. The conspiracy was never about secrecy. It was about attention. Let us talk about the Druids one more time before we move on, because they deserve more than the caricature that history has handed them. The word Druid itself is debated among scholars. One common interpretation connects it to the Celtic words for oak and knowledge, suggesting something like oak knowledge, or wisdom of the oak. This may or may not be etymologically accurate, but it captures something true about the role these figures played in Celtic society. They were not priests in the way Romans understood priests. They were not simply intermediaries between gods and people, performing rituals in designated sacred spaces. They were scholars, teachers, judges, philosophers, healers, counsellors. The Romans, characteristically, tried to fit them into a Roman category and could not quite manage it. Caesar wrote that the Druids believed in the transmigration of souls, that after death the soul moved into a new body, whether human or animal, and began life again. This belief, if accurate, would have had profound implications for how Druids understood their relationship to the natural world. If you might one day inhabit the body of a deer or a fish or a tree, if the boundary between human and non-human was not fixed but fluid, then the idea of treating the natural world as a resource to be used and discarded would seem not just foolish, but genuinely dangerous. You might be destroying something that will one day house a part of yourself. Imagine what this belief would have meant in practice. Imagine walking through a forest and understanding, not as an abstract philosophical idea, but as a felt conviction, that the deer watching you from between the trees might one day carry a soul that was once human, that the oak tree above you, ancient and gnarled and patient beyond all human reckoning, might be a resting place for a consciousness that once sat by a fire and told stories and loved someone. This kind of belief does not produce a casual relationship with the natural world. It produces reverence. It produces care. It produces the kind of deep, attentive relationship with the landscape that archaeologists have found traces of everywhere they have looked in Celtic territory. The forests the Celts lived in were not the kind of forests we think of today, managed, thinned, and domesticated by centuries of human intervention. They were old-growth forests, dense and dark and alive with a complexity that modern ecology is only beginning to understand. The canopy was so thick in places that the forest floor was perpetually dim, a world of green shadow and filtered light, where the air was cool and damp and smelled of moss and earth and the slow, patient process of decay that feeds new growth. To move through such a forest was to move through something that felt, unmistakably, alive. Not alive in the way a person is alive, but alive in a deeper, slower, more ancient sense. Alive the way the earth itself is alive. The Celts knew this forest intimately. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They knew where the deer gathered in the early morning and where the salmon ran in autumn. They knew the cycles of the seasons with a precision that came not from observation alone, but from generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, in exactly the kind of living transmission that their oral tradition was designed to preserve. This is speculative, of course. We cannot know exactly what the Druids believed, because they did not write it down. But the belief in transmigration, combined with the Celtic reverence for sacred landscapes and the deep ecological knowledge that Celtic communities clearly possessed, knowledge of plants, of animals, and of the rhythms of the seasons that goes far beyond what casual observation could provide, all of this suggests a worldview in which humans were not masters of the earth, but participants in it. Not the rulers of nature, but one voice among many in an ongoing conversation. The Romans found this deeply unsettling. A worldview in which humans were not supreme, in which the land had its own authority, and in which power was not concentrated in human hands, but distributed throughout a living system. This challenged something fundamental about the Roman self-understanding. Rome was built on the idea of dominion, of conquest, of imposing human will upon the world. The Celtic way of seeing things, quiet, reciprocal, humble in its recognition of human limitation, was not just foreign to Rome. It was in some sense a rebuke. And so Rome did what empires have always done when they encounter a worldview that threatens their own. They dismissed it. They ridiculed it. They simplified it into something that could be safely ignored or safely conquered. They turned the Druids into exotic curiosities, or into frightening witch doctors performing bloody rituals in dark groves. Anything that would make the Celtic worldview seem less like a serious alternative to Roman civilization, and more like a quaint primitive aberration. But the Druids disappeared from the historical record not because they ceased to exist, but because the Romans stopped writing about them. After the conquest of Gaul, the Druids were suppressed. Their gatherings were banned, and their authority was undermined by the new Roman administrative structure. But suppression is not the same as destruction. The knowledge they carried did not vanish. It dispersed. It moved into the communities. It became part of the ordinary, everyday understanding that Celtic people carried with them as they went about their lives, growing food, raising animals, marking the seasons, and telling stories to their children by firelight. And centuries later, when scholars began to piece together what Celtic civilization had actually been like, not through the Roman accounts alone, but through the myths, the place names, the archaeological evidence, and the folklore that persisted in rural communities long after the official history had declared the Celts conquered and forgotten, they began to see the outlines of something that had never truly disappeared, something that had simply gone quiet, something that had been there all along, waiting in the silence, waiting in the land, waiting in the stories that grandmothers told their grandchildren on winter evenings when the fire was low and the wind was moving through the darkness outside. There is a phenomenon that linguists call substrate influence. It is the way in which a language that is replaced by another language, through conquest, migration, or cultural pressure, leaves traces of itself in the new language, words, phrases, and ways of expressing certain ideas that the conquering language did not have its own words for. These traces persist for centuries, sometimes millennia, long after the original language has ceased to be spoken. Celtic languages left extraordinary traces across Europe. The place names of Britain, France, and much of continental Europe are thick with Celtic roots. Rivers, hills, forests, towns, the names the Celts gave to these places persisted even after the Celtic languages themselves were replaced by Latin, and then by the various languages that evolved from Latin. The name of Paris comes from a Celtic tribal name. The name of the Rhine may have Celtic origins. Across the British Isles, the majority of ancient place names, the names of rivers especially, are Celtic in origin, predating the arrival of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings. These names are not simply labels. They are in many cases descriptions. Celtic place names often encode information about the character of a place, its landscape, its water, and its relationship to the surrounding terrain. They are in a sense a map made of language, a way of describing the world that preserves, in compressed and ancient form, the Celtic understanding of how places relate to each other and to the people who live among them. When you walk through the countryside of Wales or Ireland or Scotland, and you pay attention to the place names, the old names, the ones that predate the English language by centuries, you are walking through a landscape that is still, in some small but real way, Celtic. The names are still there. The knowledge encoded in them is still there, though it requires patience and scholarship to decode. The land remembers even when the people have forgotten. The night is very deep now. The world outside is quiet. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the stillness. We are coming to the end of our story, but not to an ending. That is an important distinction. The story of the Celts does not end. It does not conclude with a neat resolution or a final revelation. It simply opens up, like a landscape seen from a hilltop, into a vista that extends further than you can see. But let us stay with it a little longer. Let us follow the thread a little further into the quiet. The rediscovery of Celtic civilization, the slow, patient, painstaking work of scholars and archaeologists and linguists who have spent generations piecing together what Celtic life was actually like. This work is still ongoing. It is far from complete. There are vast gaps in our knowledge, and there probably always will be, because the Celts made a choice thousands of years ago not to write things down. They made a choice that meant their story would have to be reconstructed from fragments, from traces, from the things they left behind in the earth and the things they left behind in the stories that survived. But what has been reconstructed, even in its incomplete form, is enough to overturn some of the oldest and most persistent assumptions about ancient European civilization. It is enough to suggest that the Romans' account of the Celts was not history but propaganda. It is enough to suggest that the silence the Celts chose was not emptiness but fullness. It is enough to suggest that the way these people lived, quietly, attentively, in deep relationship with the land they inhabited, was not a primitive stage on the way to civilization, but a civilization in its own right, a different kind of civilization, one that valued different things, one that measured success not in conquests or monuments or written records, but in the health of the land, the strength of the community, and the depth of the relationship between a people and the place they called home. There is a tradition in Celtic storytelling, preserved in the Irish tales, of a place called Tir na Nog, the land of the young, a place beyond the western sea or beneath the hills, or somewhere just past the edge of the visible world, where time moves differently, where the land is always green, where there is no aging, no decay, no loss. where the people who find their way there live in a kind of eternal golden afternoon. Tir na Nog is not a place you can sail to on a map. It is not a lost continent or a forgotten island. It is, like so many things in Celtic mythology, a way of expressing something that cannot quite be captured in ordinary language. It is the feeling you get when you stand in a place of great beauty and great age, a place like the Burren, or the shores of a lake in the Scottish Highlands, or the ancient oak forests that once covered much of Europe, and you feel for a moment that time has stopped, that you're standing in a pocket of stillness in the midst of a world that is always moving, always changing, always rushing towards something. The Celts understood that feeling, they named it, they built stories around it. They made it part of their understanding of the world, not as an escape from reality, but as a recognition that reality contains more than what we normally see. That beneath the surface of things, beneath the daily rhythms of work and season and community, there is something older and quieter and more enduring, something that has been there since before the first human set foot on this land, and that will be there long after the last one has gone. There are people alive today who have felt something like this. Not in Ireland necessarily, though Ireland holds more of it than almost anywhere else in Europe, but in other places too. In the ancient forests of the Scottish Highlands, where the Caledonian pines stand sparse and weathered and impossibly old against a sky that seems wider than it should be. In the standing stones of Brittany, where great monoliths of granite rise from the earth in rows that stretch for miles, placed there by hands that knew something about the relationship between stone and sky that we have lost entirely. In the chalk hills of southern England, where the landscape is so smooth and so ancient that it seems less like land and more like the surface of a dreaming mind. These are places where time behaves differently, where the present moment seems to thin, and something older and larger becomes visible beneath it. The Celts would not have been surprised by this experience. They would have nodded and said, "Yes, that is how it is. That is what the land does when you're quiet enough to notice." This is perhaps the final and deepest Celtic conspiracy, a conspiracy that was never a conspiracy at all. The idea that the world is more than it appears, that the land holds memory, that knowledge can live in places as well as in books. That power does not have to be loud to be real. That silence is not the absence of meaning, but one of its most profound expressions. The Romans built roads across Celtic territory, straight, efficient, purposeful roads that connected the centres of Roman power and made it easier to move armies and goods from one part of the empire to another. These roads are still visible in the landscape today in some places, remarkably well preserved given their age, monuments to Roman engineering and Roman will. But the Celtic paths, the older paths, the ones that wound through the landscape following the contours of the hills and the courses of the rivers and the ancient lines of travel between sacred sites, those paths did not disappear either. They simply went quiet. They became footpaths, then barely visible trails, then nothing at all in most places. But in some places they persisted, in Ireland especially, where Roman conquest was never complete. The old paths continued to be walked, continued to connect the places that mattered, continued to carry people between the sacred sites and the seasonal gathering places and the ancient burial grounds that dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in a very long and very slow sentence. Walk one of these paths today, if you can find one. Walk it slowly, in the early morning or the late afternoon when the light is soft and the world is quiet. Pay attention to where it goes. Pay attention to what it connects. Pay attention to the way it moves through the landscape, not fighting the terrain, not cutting straight through it, but flowing with it, following the natural logic of the hills and the valleys and the water. You are walking on a path that someone walked 3,000 years ago. Someone who understood this land in ways we have only begun to recover. Someone who chose this route not because it was the fastest way from one place to another, but because it was the most meaningful. Because it passed through places that mattered. because it connected points of significance in a web of relationships that stretched across the entire landscape. The path is still there. The knowledge it represents is still there, encoded in the curve of the route, in the places it touches, and in the way it moves through the world. It has been quiet for a very long time, but it has never stopped being walked. We are nearing the end of our journey tonight, but before we close, let us sit with one more image, one more moment of stillness. Somewhere in the west of Ireland, on a night in late October, thousands of years ago, a community gathered at the edge of a bog. The night was cold, that particular cold that comes in the Celtic twilight, when the last warmth of summer has finally left the air and the first real breath of winter touches your skin. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in a sky that was not yet fully dark. A great fire was being built, not for warmth alone, but for ceremony, for the marking of a boundary, the end of one year and the beginning of another. This was Samhain. The festival is at the turning point of the Celtic year, the night when the doors of the Cid opened, and the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, the world of the ancestors, and the world of the Tuatha De Danann became thin enough to step through. People gathered from across the region, families who had not seen each other since the last great gathering, young people who had come of age over the summer, elders who carried the weight of memory and the responsibility of passing it on. The Druids, or whoever filled that role in this particular community, would have been present, guiding the ceremony, speaking the words that connected this night to all the Samhains that had come before it, stretching back into a past so deep that no single memory could hold it all. The smoke from the fire rose straight up into the still air, a dark column against the stars, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and heather and something older, earthier, the smell of peat that had been laid on the flames deliberately, connecting the fire to the land beneath it, to the bog that stretched away into the darkness beyond the circle of light. The children were quiet now, watching the flames with wide, serious eyes. They understood, even at their young age, that this was not an ordinary night, that something was happening that went beyond the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being gathered together with the people they loved. An elder spoke, not loudly. There was no need for loudness in a group this size, in a silence this complete. She spoke the names of the dead from the past year, each name spoken with care, with attention, with the weight that comes from knowing a person well and mourning their absence. And after each name, a pause, a moment of stillness in which the community collectively held the memory of that person, their face, their voice, their particular way of moving through the world, before letting it settle back into the silence from which it had been called. This was the work of Samhain. Not a celebration exactly, though there was joy in the gathering. Not mourning exactly, though there was grief in the remembering. It was something in between, something that the Celtic understanding of the world made room for in a way that later civilizations, with their sharper divisions between life and death, and between the sacred and the ordinary, would find difficult to accommodate. It was the acknowledgement that the dead were not gone, not entirely, that they were present in the land, in the stories and in the memories of the living, that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was not a wall but a membrane, permeable, thin enough on certain nights to feel. The fire burned, the stories were told. The names of the dead were spoken aloud so that they would not be forgotten, so that they would know they were remembered, and so that the connection between the living and the dead remained unbroken. Offerings were made to the bog, to the land, and to the invisible presences that the community understood to be part of their world, even though they could not be seen. And then, as the fire burned lower, and the night deepened, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, the community began to disperse, back to their homes, their families, their daily lives, but carrying with them, as they always did, the knowledge that had been spoken and sung and shared that night, carrying it in their memories, in their bodies, in the way they understood the world and their place in it. No one wrote it down. No one needed to. This is how knowledge survives when it is not written on paper, not as a fixed thing, a monument, or a record that can be pointed to and said to be the truth, but as a living thing, moving from person to person, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to new circumstances and new understandings, but holding its essential shape, holding its core meaning, the way a river holds its essential character even as the water in it is constantly changing, constantly flowing through and constantly being replaced by new water from new rain. The Celts understood this. They understood that knowledge is not a thing to be possessed, but a thing to be participated in. A conversation, not a monologue. A relationship, not a transaction. And they built their entire civilization on that understanding, quietly, patiently, without leaving the kind of dramatic monuments or written records that later civilizations would use to measure and judge them. They left something else instead. They left the land itself marked with the traces of their attention. They left the stories, worn smooth by centuries of retelling but still holding their shape. They left the place names, encoded with information about the character of the landscape. They left the paths, winding through the hills in patterns that reflect a deep understanding of how the world fits together. They left, in short, everything that matters, and nothing that does not. The conspiracies that were actually true. Let us gather them up gently before we let them go. The conspiracy of silence. The deliberate choice not to write, made not out of ignorance but out of a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge works best when it lives in living minds, rather than on dead pages. A choice that looked to the Romans like backwardness, but was actually a form of intellectual courage. A bet that the relationship between teacher and student, between elder and young person, and between story and listener was more valuable than any book. The conspiracy of the landscape, the careful, patient selection of sacred sites based not on military or economic logic, but on a felt sense of the land's own significance. A practice that the Romans dismissed as superstition, but that reflected a genuine and profound relationship between a people and the territory they inhabited. A relationship that was not simply about using the land, but about listening to it. The conspiracy of shared power, the intricate, invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity that distributed authority so thoroughly that no single person could accumulate too much of it. A system that looked, from the outside, like chaos or the absence of leadership, but was actually one of the most sophisticated forms of social organisation ever devised. A system built not on force, but on relationship. Not on conquest, but on consensus. The conspiracy of survival. The way Celtic knowledge persisted through centuries of Roman conquest and Christian conversion, and cultural amnesia, not because it was hidden in secret, but because it was woven into the fabric of daily life, into the stories, into the seasonal rituals, into the names of places and the paths through the hills, and the deep embodied understanding that communities carried with them wherever they went. A survival that looked, to anyone not paying close attention, like disappearance. But it was actually something much more interesting, something much more quiet, something much more enduring. The fire is very low now. The night is at its deepest. Somewhere far away, on the other side of the world, the sun is rising over landscapes that the Celts never knew about. But here, in the darkness, in the stillness, the old knowledge is still present, not as a dramatic revelation, not as a secret finally uncovered after centuries of mystery, but as something that was always there, in the land and in the stories and in the way certain places still make you stop and breathe and pay attention, even if you could not explain why. The Celts did not need to write it down for it to be true. They did not need Rome's permission for it to matter. They did not need us to understand it in order for it to have shaped the world we live in. The knowledge persisted. The relationship persisted. The quiet, patient, enduring conversation between a people and their land persisted through conquest and conversion, and the long, slow passage of centuries, it is still going on, right now. In the places where the old paths still wind through the hills, in the stories that grandmothers still tell without quite knowing where the stories came from, in the way that certain landscapes still hold something in them, some quality of attention, some sense of depth and presence, that reaches across thousands of years and touches something in us that is older than language. You do not need to go to Ireland to feel it. You do not need to stand on a Celtic hilltop or walk through an ancient bog. You simply need to be quiet enough and still enough and patient enough to notice what has always been there. The land remembers, the stories remember, and somewhere, in the long silence between one heartbeat and the next, the Celts are still speaking. Let the silence come now. Let it settle around you like snow, like mist, like the slow darkening of a sky at the end of a long autumn day. There is nothing left to say, and everything has been said, and both of these things are true at the same time. That is the Celtic way of it. That is the way of all the old knowledge that lived before the written word, and that will continue to live long after the last page has been turned. Sleep now. The land is quiet. The stories are resting. And somewhere, in the deep and ancient dark, the conversation continues.